Hello, everybody. Good late morning for those of you who are here in Bonn. Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening for those of you joining us virtually. I want to welcome you to our side advance on advancing a human rights-based approach to climate finance, which is an event that is co-organized by the Deutsche Gesellschaft für internationale Zusammenarbeit or German Society for International Cooperation, GIC, the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, the United Nations Development Programme, and the United Nations Environment Programme, as well as my own organization, the Heinrich Böll Foundation. And my name is Liane Schalatek. I'm in the Heinrich Böll Foundation office in Washington, where I follow climate finance. So we know that climate finance is the thing that moves climate ambition. We know that it is what actually helps the most vulnerable people, countries, and communities to implement their priorities for climate action, for urgent climate action. We also know that in the climate process, climate finance is what very often stalls outcomes. And for those of us here in Bonn and those of you listening virtually, we know that a lot of the discourses here in the process this past week and this week have centered around climate finance, whether it's the global stocktake, where we are talking about ratcheting up ambition, and in the discussion it has become very clear that that needs to be accompanied by a ratcheting up of climate finance ambition, whether it's in the discourses about the new collective quantified goal post-2020 to replace the 100 billion per year by 2020 goal that we currently have, whether it's in the mitigation work program, whether it's when we are discussing the global goal on adaptation. And obviously, and a lot of attention and focus has been there here in this meeting on loss and damage, on addressing loss and damage, and the new and additional finance that is needed for that. So finance is at the core. And so obviously, in order for climate action to be human rights compatible and human rights supportive, addressing, promoting, and advancing human rights, to be gender responsive, to be taking the rights of indigenous peoples into account, by providing an intergenerational justice, by supporting the just transitions, for all of that, centering human rights and concentrating on human rights as the core foundation and the core fundament of what helps us advance impactful, just, and effective climate implementation in an equitable way. Human rights is at the core of that. And here today, at this side event, we want to actually look at some of the existing practices in climate finance through funds, through governance mechanism, those that exist and those that might be in the future, like, for example, a loss and damage finance facility. If we advance that, we want to look at what is needed to get stronger human rights impact assessments for climate action to ensure that we have strong environmental and social safeguards, meaningful and informed participation, very important, with full information disclosure and access for those that are most impacted by climate change and that need to also have the opportunity to bring their capacities and their experiences, traditional knowledge, local knowledge to bear for climate action. So we are really excited to have a wonderful panel here today. What we hope to do is that we have a number of great speakers, and you see the list of that esteemed panel here behind me, give really relatively short impact statements so that we then can go into interaction, that we can really hear from you questions, have a back and forth, and that hopefully includes, if the technique holds up and fingers crossed, our listeners, unfortunately not the one joining through YouTube, but the one that are joining through the UNFCCC platform. You on the UNFCCC platform are able to submit your questions through the chat. Please do. We should be able to monitor it here and hopefully can bring you into the discourse. But let me get started in introducing and briefly introducing and calling upon our first speaker. This is Dr. Emmanuel Tachi Obeng, who is from the Ghana Environment Protection Agency, but he's here speaking with us and sharing with us also in his capacity as the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. And we are looking forward to hear from him in particularly related to the traumatic impacts that climate impacts that we are seeing in least developing countries and African states and SIDS, including on already occurring significant economic and non-economic losses and damage, what in his view is needed to ensure that climate finance is generated, governed, and dispersed in a human rights compatible approach. And Emmanuel, if you feel comfortable here from the panel, we'd like you, obviously to make your remarks here, or if you want to go to the podium, it's up to you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Good morning, everyone.
Good morning.
Distinguished participants, I'm here to also indicate that Ghana has actually assumed the presidency of the Climate Vulnerable Forum. This means that Ghana is now the voice for the voiceless, is the voice of the countries who are now seriously being impacted by climate change. In actual fact, the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change has always been a top priority of the Climate Vulnerable Forum, which is the CVF. If you look at the Dakar-Glasgow Declaration of the CVF, which was adopted in COP26, the forum reiterated that the impact of climate change is both a human right and an ecological crisis which need to be responded to. The CVF has been at the forefront of advancing and promoting and at the same time supporting the work of the UN human rights mechanisms in the thematic area of climate change. After many years, we have successfully advocated for a creation of a new special rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. The CVF presidency therefore welcomes the nomination of Mr. Lanfry, whom I see on our panel, to be our first mandated special rapporteur on human rights. Mr. Fly, you are really welcome to CVF and to the entire vulnerable countries. In the context of climate change finance, we will really encourage you as a rapporteur to actively issue public information on climate change finance and human rights. This is what we really mandated you to do on our behalf. In the context of climate change and finance, a human rights-based approach is also recommended, taking into account in development, implementation, monitoring, and monitoring of relevant processes of institutions. As you know, development of developed countries should not be at the expense of vulnerable countries. So this is also very, very important, that in all your actions, you need to align it to the plight of vulnerable countries. So over here, we consider human rights to include participation, transparency, accountability, and equity, among others. The CVS is particularly also concerned over lack of ambition on climate finance from developed countries, as we saw in COP26. The $100 billion failure and the growing financial gap has also increased our vulnerability. If I'm saying our vulnerability, I'm talking to vulnerable countries of the world. And this is actually causing a delay in the action of implementation of our climate change programs. And this is what we can least afford. As vulnerable countries continue to call for the delivery plan for the $100 billion in climate change finance per year, at COP27, we must also recognize the potential human rights impact. And that must ensure the rights that guides, as I've already said, development, implementation, monitoring, and climate-related processes and mechanisms. Furthermore, at COP27, the Glasgow dialogue must ensure that loss and damage is properly mandated from a flow from the wealthy and responsible countries in an adequate volumes and as rapid as possible. As highlighted in our findings of the V20 latest Commission report, the vulnerable countries has launched our report, which indicate that vulnerable countries would have been 20% wealthier, but with climate change. So you can see the fate of ours as at today. Loss and damage, therefore, goes beyond economy. You see, it would have been wealthier, goes beyond economy to adverse impact that felt across spectrum of collection of individual fundamental human rights. The international climate change community has a duty to respond to this injustice. So I'm very happy that we've been invited to voice out what we have, as I've elaborated, to you and the entire global community. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tachio Beng, and I understand that you will be able, and we're very happy about that, to stay with us for the duration of the panel. And so hopefully when we have a back and forth, we can engage with you and with the work that the Climate Vulnerable Forum is doing, including the report that you just highlighted. And I particularly appreciate, as you have pointed out, that the lack of ambition in the process is really in many ways a violation, a human rights violation, a violation of human rights, and the importance that conveys collectively, but in particularly for developed countries to fulfill the human rights obligation, including the human rights obligation to ensure livelihoods and at the most barest level, survival of those innocent who have contributed very little to the climate crisis that we are facing right now. You also highlighted the importance of institutions, and this gives me a wonderful segue to our second speaker, which is Hauke Prankarp from the German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, where he is a senior policy officer at the division that deals with human rights and the inclusion more broadly. And I would invite Hauke to actually share with us some work that they have been doing, particularly on the context of climate change and some of the interactions with the COVID impacts. And please, Hauke, we are looking forward to hear from you.
Yeah, thank you very much. Very good morning to everyone. Distinguished panelists, partners and participants, dear colleagues, let me start by thanking the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights for convening this event and for providing the space to discuss this really crucial and urgent issue of climate finance and human rights. Human rights, in our mind, are guiding principles of German development policy. They are key to sustainable and inclusive development. And that is why, together with our partners, we strive to promote human rights across all sectors, including climate and the environment. In the face of the latest IPCC report and its warning against irreversible impacts on human well-being and on the health of planet Earth as such, it becomes clear that the protection and promotion of human rights must be at the heart of any climate action, really, especially when financing climate mitigation and adaptation measures. A human rights-based approach to climate finance is key to preventing and mitigating negative human rights impacts of climate change and climate finance measures. Only a human rights-based approach can empower disadvantaged persons and groups, including, for example, women, indigenous peoples, youth, or persons with disabilities, to meaningfully participate in climate decision-making processes and in accessing climate funds. The German Federal Ministry for Economic Cooperation and Development, or BMZ, provides the majority of the German contributions to international climate finance. And in this role, BMZ is committed to strengthening disadvantaged persons and groups as agents of change, and thus to empower them to promote effective solutions to climate action and climate finance. And to achieve this, our ministry builds on a lot of successful partnerships with international organizations and initiatives, and of course also with civil society actors. And just to give you an example, together with the International Working Group for Indigenous Affairs, we developed a proposal on effective participation of indigenous peoples and safeguarding their rights in Green Climate Fund projects. And in addition, BMZ supported the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights in cooperation with the Climate Vulnerable Forum in developing a study report on human rights implications of COVID-19 response measures in the context of climate change, which will be launched today and which in fact represents a key element of today's event. And therefore, I would like to thank once again and congratulate the Office of the High Commissioner for Human Rights on this comprehensive and very innovative work. The report not only fills a critical gap by examining the nexus of COVID-19 response measures, their interconnection with climate finance, and their implications for human rights, but most importantly, it provides practical guidance for states, development cooperation actors, and international financial institutions on applying a human rights-based approach to both climate finance and COVID-19 rescue and recovery policies. And to conclude, I would like to highlight we need more of these successful partnerships and alliances to translate human rights obligations in climate finance into practice. And we need transformative approaches to address the interlinked impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic and the triple planetary crisis. And now I wish all of us an exciting and fruitful exchange. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Hauke, particularly for pointing out the need for successful and thinking out of the box collaborations to actually show those vast interlinkages. I think one of the biggest problems that we have with the fact that climate finance and related finance is not as human rights centered and as human rights focused as it is that we have very much very narrow thinking in boxes approach to implementation and governments, whether that's the discourse about, a climate a climate project, not really having to take development into account, but focusing solely on the climate projects, or actually a hierarchical approach in the consideration of the various impacts that a project have, where you, in many cases, and we have seen that in the implementation in many funds, prioritize mitigation and emission reductions over a larger and more holistic set of multiple benefits that would center more broadly on human rights, indigenous people's rights, gender rights, the inclusion of youth, elderly and the disabled, and ensuring that their livelihoods are actually put at the center of the measure. So thank you very much. Also, and I think this is again an obligation for all countries, but particularly also developed countries, in trying to guide how COVID recovery finance is going. We are a little bit disturbed, actually not a little bit, quite a bit disturbed by the fact that a lot of the COVID response measures actually have not taken climate change sufficiently into account, whether that's on infrastructure or whether it's regarding the simple lessons learned that actually well-functioning support systems are probably one of the best resilience building and adaptation measures that we have, and that they need and deserve support, including in the context of climate finance provision. So thank you very much. I want to now turn to the excitement in the wider human rights and climate change community about the appointment of Ian Fry was already conveyed, but I wanted now to turn to Ian. First of all, welcome him here. We are glad to have him here on the panel, and also highlight that his mandate comes with very high expectation for what he can do as the UN Special Rapporteur on the promotion and protection of human rights in the context of climate change. I think Ian is wonderfully up to the task. He had a long engagement, obviously, with the climate process, as well as negotiator for Tuvalu for many years, including on loss and damage, that is coming now rightfully, as it should, to the forefront of some of the discussions here. And so, Ian, we are really excited to learn from you what some of your thinking about approaches and ways are to, within your mandate, focus on the particular role of climate finance. Over to you.
Thank you very much for inviting me, and can I give particular gratitude to the Climate Vulnerable Forum for your hard work in getting this mandate up in the first place. It took a number of years to get enough acceptance by parties, and a lot of hard work to get it there. So I want to express my extreme gratitude for that. I've only been in the position for a very short time, so I'm just finding my feet and getting up to speed with the issues. But I've sort of identified, some key issues that I'll be addressing, and one of them in particular is the loss and damage issue, which I'll be reporting to the UN General Assembly in October of this year on it. And I wanted to focus my thinking around that as far as talking about climate finance is concerned. The International Displacement Monitoring Centre estimates that over 20 million people are displaced every day on average as a consequence of weather-related events. 20 million people. So you can think, just imagine the huge economic and social cost that is confronted by these people, but also by the economies of the countries where these people are. The disruption to the economies of those countries is enormous. The World Food Programme estimates that there will be 20% of the world's population will be in global hunger by 2050 as a consequence of climate change. And there are other estimates around access to water. With a 2 degrees temperature rise, 1 billion people will suffer a shortage of access to water. So these are enormous economic and social and human rights costs as a consequence of climate change. And then we have to compare these enormous costs to the amount of money that's been pledged so far through this agreement, $100 billion by 2020. And this was a pledge made a number of years, over a decade ago, and still that money hasn't been reached. There have been other studies. Oxfam has done a report on the sort of humanitarian appeals that are provided to countries and people that are affected by these storm events. Only 54% of the funding, on average, is given out to help people deal with these climate events. And they estimate that we're suffering a $28 to $34 billion shortfall in meeting the costs of dealing with the harm caused by these events. And that doesn't include the sort of non-economic costs, and I'll come back to that issue later. If we look at just some specific events, Hurricane Maria caused damage equivalent to 226% of the GDP of Dominica, an enormous cost. In my region, in the Pacific, Cyclone Pam in 2015 cost Vanuatu $449 million, 64% of their GDP. And in Tuvalu's case, around $50 million worth of damage. And for a very small country, and the cyclone didn't go very close to that country, again, 40% of the GDP of that country was affected. So these are huge costs, and we are suffering a huge shortfall between what's being provided with climate finance and what the world needs are. So we've got a huge gap in finance, and organisations like Climate Analytics suggest that by 2030 we'll be suffering costs of around $400 to $431 billion. So the critical issue is, and the $100 billion that has been pledged, none of that has been pledged towards loss and damage. And so we're not even on the page as far as finance for loss and damage is concerned. And we really need to take urgent action to bring loss and damage into the financial field. And I appreciate the efforts by civil society in trying to bring forward proposals, particularly around a new finance mechanism for loss and damage. And finally, while we can put these sort of costs in dollar terms, there are a lot of costs, non-economic costs to individuals, particularly Indigenous peoples, who don't operate on the financial systems that we have. There are costs, human rights costs to Indigenous peoples, and we'll no doubt hear about this in our panel, is critical. So we have to find a way of getting the polluters to pay in this system. Not just countries, but also corporations. So I appeal to you to think creatively about how we can, advance this agenda and make these shortfall up for these shortfalls. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ian, and I think those are really powerful words in pointing out that the enormous economic costs, social costs, and human rights costs obviously can't be captured solely in climate finance, but at least climate finance should try to be a better job, to do a better job in being up to the task, in tackling some of the most pressing problems, and that obviously includes addressing loss and damage, in particularly for which so far we have not seen any finance. And again, with a lot of the discussions that are going on here right now, there is really the push to include financing for addressing loss and damage as the third distinct financing goal, for example, in the deliberations for the new collective quantified goal. So really, really important that that is anchored centrally in when we are discussing what the global climate finance architecture needs for 2025 and beyond in numbers that are commensurate with the challenge. And again, all of that should not distract from the real costs in human lives and disrupted human livelihoods and the non-economic losses and damages, like, for example, cultural heritage, experience, and a way of life of groups, including indigenous groups. I want to turn, just because you brought up the particular role and impact on indigenous peoples, next to our next speaker, who is Eileen Marina Cunningham, who is with the, and my Spanish is poor, so please forgive me, Asociación Indígena Centro para la Autonomía y Desarrollo de las Pueblos Indígenas, and I should have probably not even attempted that, CATPI, but the role in which I know her more closely, and we've worked for many years together, is at currently one of the CSO active observers for the Green Climate Fund, representing developing countries, communities, indigenous peoples, and civil society organizations. And please, Eileen.
Thank you, Liane. And I'm going to say it in English. It's the Center for the Autonomy and Development of Indigenous People. We're based in Nicaragua. And thank you for the invitation to this panel, and also thank you for bringing the indigenous people issues to this discussion. When we talk about climate finance, what we see as indigenous people is still a big challenge in terms of access, first to information, and then also about the access to direct access to the financial mechanism, to the funds. And even we are not integrated in the different, there is some examples, but in most of the funding proposal that came to the GCF, we are not integrated in the government structure of this funding proposal or project. So, and we think that this is really a big challenge, and it's a really pending assignment of the different accredited entities and also from the different financial mechanisms, because most of these activities are going to be implemented in indigenous people lands, territories, and will affect our livelihood or way of life or resources. And what we see every year is the increase of the financial flow. And the other thing that is pending there is no data, there is no information how this financial flow is going to indigenous territory, how many indigenous are going to accessing to this, or if this is direct or not, if it's implemented by indigenous people or not. And when we talk about finance, climate finance, and human rights, it's really what we see is that there is lack of inclusion of indigenous people in all these and other social groups. And what we saw in different parts of the world is there are a lot of projects that are coming now, like projects that want to tackle climate change, projects that want to go to the just transition. And what they're doing is violating the right of indigenous people and also the local community. For example, if we see all these projects about dam and hydroelectric, dams are still identifying as clean energy, but we see in our lands and territories that is violation of human rights because different projects of dam, there is such land grabbing. We see food insecurity, we have seen abuse of women, and also a rise and even murder of our social and indigenous leaders because these are climate change projects. And We see also in the just transition of energy that there is a lot of big energy project, millionaire project, near to indigenous people, lands and territories, and indigenous people don't have access to this, access to energy. 70% of the indigenous at global level don't have access to energy, but most of the project, hydroelectric, windmills, are in our lands and territories. I want to talk about the Right Energy Partnership with Indigenous People initiative. That this partnership has been impulsed by Indigenous People Major Group, and we consider that the human rights should be integrated and should be one of the basic elements when we want to work in any climate change activities. And also, we think it's important in this process to include the human right in climate finance. In the context of indigenous people, we think that there should be also a minimum standard for all these projects that came to our lands and territories, and it's the right to all these rights that are recognized in the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. And when we see financial entities like the Green Climate Fund, they are seeking for a paradigm shift. And in most of the funding proposal that came to the board, the inclusion of human rights should be also a norm. And above all, that they should establish precise standards for their norms to all these accredited entities. So we think it's necessary to learn from other experience. The Green Climate Fund is necessary to learn there, that are taking the right approach, the right-based approach as basis of all his action, and that the human rights should be respected and promoted, and also defined in the benefit sharing process. We also think it's important in all these projects the full and effective participation of communities, the right, in the case of indigenous people, the right to self-determination, the right to the free, prior, and informed consent, and also we think it's important strong safeguard on place. And also, above all, we think is important the inclusion of the empowerment of indigenous women and accountability, transparency, and also this mutual respect that we should have, that is human right, no? We have examples with the Right Energy Partnership of Indigenous People, where we have agreement with some founders of the UN system and other founders of private founders, and we have generated process from the local level, from the communities that are process, indigenous-led process in energy transition. And these activities are not only be led by indigenous, but have all these principles in place. And this is the paradigm shift that all these financial mechanisms are looking for, but they are not seen because they think indigenous people don't have the capacity to deal with all this process. So this is moving forward of this business as usual perspective, and we move forward to a right-based approach in all this action that want to tackle climate change. Thank you, Lian.
Thank you very much, Eileen. And I think the last point that you made is really at the core. When you talk about paradigm shift, and when you talk about transformational change, what is really the change that you want to see and that you are supporting? And it's not in the financial, in the financialization innovation or the innovative financing products or instruments. It is in the way you are engaging those most affected by, but also being able to contribute with their own knowledge, with their own solutions to addressing climate change. It is placing questions of access to resources, including financial resources like climate finance, but also to the resources and that are generated by climate finance, like, for example, renewable energy resources, at the governance of the people that should benefit from them. And again, it should not be a benign benefit sharing mechanism. It should be a benefit determination mechanism with the affected communities, indigenous peoples in the driver's seat in project management and making those project implementation decisions as equal partners in the implementation. I also really appreciate that you pointed out that, of course, vulnerabilities is very intersectional. The capacity to address is very intersectional by pointing out in particular the role also and the participation of Indigenous women. And with that, I want to go to our next speaker, to Kikashan Basu, who is the founder and president of the Green Hope Foundation and a counselor for the World Future Council. And I've experienced Kikoshan as a force of nature, actually, within the process of the Generation Equality Forum. And if people don't know what the Generation Equality Forum is, this is one of the follow-up processes of the Commission on the Status of Women, comes out of the Beijing Plus 25 process, and is actually looking at partnerships for advancing feminist climate action, including with advances in feminist climate finance. So, Kikoshan, please.
Thank you very much, Leanne, and hello, everyone. It is great to share this space with all of you today. As was mentioned, my name is Gahakasha, and I'm the founder president of Green Hope Foundation, which is a global organization working across 26 countries with over 300,000 people all across the world. And we have been working at the ground level for over a decade now, and our experiences at the grassroots level have brought forward some recurring themes in terms of climate finance. The first one being that climate finance is a very complicated process that very often does not reach those who are the most vulnerable to climate change. And one of the main aspects that ensures the not reaching of funds to the most vulnerable is the presence of middlemen, particularly in those very marginalized communities. Now, for instance, in Kiribati, we work on restoring the mangrove cover. We work on addressing the very unique challenges that the women and girls face as a result of climate change that's amplified the challenges, particularly in terms of sexual and reproductive health and rights. And Kiribati is put forward as a small island developing state, and a lot of institutions say that they are dedicating their funding towards SIDS, but we work on the ground there, and we've seen that none of the funding reaches those communities over there. And we see the same story in other parts of the world as well. We work in Peru in a local community there where we train the women on organic farming to address food security issues. And similarly, we don't see any of the funds actually reach those communities. Now, as a grassroots NGO, we at Green Hope Foundation do our bit to ensure that we invest in these communities for long-term sustainability. But we understand that there needs to be a lot more done by governments, by private sector, by multilateral institutions to really ensure that the burden doesn't fall on grassroots NGOs like us with very limited funding to ensure and build resilience in these communities. Now, the other aspect that we've seen is something that was already touched on by many of our panelists. We've seen that the whole way that we address climate finance is still not intersectional. And we need that intersectionality because different communities, different people face view climate change differently, face the impacts of climate change in different ways. So we need to bring in the aspect of gender, we need to bring in the aspect of race, we need to bring in all of these unique social determinants that form the lived experiences of people affected most by climate change, so that we can actually bring forward and advance human rights in terms of climate finance. And the final thing that we have seen that in terms of climate finance is that it still doesn't take into account the tremendous digital divide that exists in our world. Now, with most of our transactions and banking taking place online now, the people affected most by climate change are on the other side of the digital divide, and therefore they are not able to access these funds that are promised by so many governments and institutions. So again, that is something that we at Green Hope Foundation are addressing through solar installations all across the world. But we need that accountability, we need that ambition, and we need that action from these large-scale institutions to make sure that we're able to address the digital divide, turn that divide into a dividend, and really ensure that this climate finance reaches those who are the most vulnerable. So based on these grassroots experiences, taking into account all of these aspects and addressing these recurring themes, that is the only way that we can truly advance human rights in terms of climate finance and ensure that we truly leave no one behind. Thank you.
Kishan, thank you very much. And I think the example of your work as a women-led, young woman-led grassroots organization that is actually engaging and working with and for local communities really shows the power of what can happen if access for those actors, local actors, indigenous groups, women's groups, feminist groups, the youth and others is actually increased through the funds, and provision of funding is actually not an approach that assumes a trickle down of finance to those groups will somehow happen, but facilitates the direct access, including enhanced direct access with devolved decision making, where actually some of the funding decision of funds from, for example, the Green Climate Fund and others are made at the most local level. That brings us to our next speaker, and we are actually very, very grateful that Tiffany Hodgson, is joining us from the GCF Secretariat in Songdo in South Korea. Tiffany is the Environmental and Social Safeguards Gender and Indigenous Peoples Manager, and is in this capacity at the moment actually quite busy in trying to develop and advance the GCF's own environmental and social safeguards. This is obviously very crucial, as we have heard, for a human rights-based approach to climate finance. We cannot just get stuck on do no harm, on preventing that some of the funded actions have unintended or sometimes maybe even intended consequences that lead to human rights violation, but that they are actually a mechanism for the better, actually help us in doing good by really proactively pushing the human rights agenda forward. So Tiffany, over to you.
Thanks, Leanne, and I think you summarized my intervention really well. It's a great pleasure for me to be on this panel and to join the esteemed speakers. So, like Leanne mentioned, my name is Tiffany. I'm a sustainability team manager, and we work on environmental and social safeguards, gender, indigenous peoples matters. So, as you can imagine, human rights are close to our hearts and part of our daily work as well. Just to say thank you to the organizers for allowing me to join this important event from South Korea. And like others, I want to also take the opportunity to congratulate Dr. Ian Fry on his appointment as the first Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and Climate Change. And I really appreciate his insights on how we can improve climate finance from a human rights perspective, his comments today and hopefully also in future discussions. As the world's largest climate fund, we're pleased to be part of this conversation and to provide information about an ongoing process that we could benefit from further input from on human rights, and this is the process that Leanne has mentioned. So I want to talk about how we are developing a new set of environmental and social safeguard standards. As many of you will know, the Green Climate Fund uses currently the International Finance Corporation's performance standards, the IFC performance standards, as our interim environmental and social safeguards. The ESS standards guide all of those that work with the GCF funds, accredited entities, executing entities, countries, all stakeholders, in identifying, avoiding, mitigating, and managing environmental and social risks and impacts. They allow the Green Climate Fund to ensure that our funded activities do no harm. And like it was mentioned, at the same time, we're also looking for co-benefits and ensuring that co-benefits are part and parcel of climate action. We give due consideration to adequate and meaningful stakeholder engagement, grievance redress, information disclosure, etc. So human rights are already well entrenched in the GCF policies that were adopted by the board, and these new ESS standards that we're developing should further align with that and will further align with those. So for instance, our Indigenous peoples policy recognizes key international human rights and principles and states that all GCF activities must respect the principles set forth in UNDP and other relevant international and regional instruments relating to the rights of Indigenous peoples. We also have a newly established Indigenous Peoples Advisory Group, and we look forward to their advice, to AEs, to the Secretariat, to our board, on how to better ensure the protection on Indigenous peoples' rights. Second, we have an environmental and social policy that requires that all activities are designed and implemented in a manner that promotes, protects, and fulfills universal respect for all and observance of human rights for all. In September last year, that policy was also revised with a lot of stakeholder input, including from the observers, to include further provisions to safeguard against sexual exploitation, abuse, and harassment at the project level. A third example I could give is our updated gender policy. It has 3 objectives, one of which is to promote climate investments that advance gender equality, minimize risks, while also endeavoring to promote respect for and observance of human rights. So as you can see, human rights are really entrenched in our policies, and we need to make sure that our new safeguards do the same. So we're developing this new set of standards, building on evolving best practice, incorporating multi-stakeholder participation, and we want to make sure that they're really tailored to the Climate Fund and that they're strengthened. So this is a great opportunity to ensure that the standards give due consideration to human rights. We're in the middle of stage 3 right now, and we're taking into account all the stakeholder input that we've received so far in the first 2 stages, which was considerable. We really received a lot, and we appreciate all of it. Here I can thank OHCHR for their detailed submission, thank Leanne, Eileen, many others in the room for their input as the GCF active observers as well. The main deliverable for stage 3 will be the full ESS draft, so that's what we're currently working on, and we're planning further stakeholder engagement to take place on that still during this year before it goes to the board. Human rights are proposed to be strengthened across the standards, just to mention a few: labour and working conditions, community health and safety, land rights, Indigenous peoples' rights, etc. And we're proposing to add 2 new standards as well to cover and reinforce stakeholder engagement and on climate change resilience. And of course, these also have strong human rights implications, so we look forward to your reviews on those as well. So this event is very timely. Let me end by extending the invite again to get engaged and to raise the voices of the most vulnerable in the safeguards development process at the GCF. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiffany, and I hope that you can join us for the discussion that we have, so that you can stay online would be wonderful, and appreciate very much you laying out the whole range of policies that the GCF have that actually anchor human rights. Now we know that policies are only as good as their application and implementation, and there, I would say there is quite a bit that can still be improved, not only in the Green Climate Fund, but in many other funds, where we see that some of the transparency and accountability for what is happening during implementation, including necessary adaptive management for course correction, is not always yet happening to the extent that we see, which is why, and the GCF has those as well as do have other funds, the role of grievance mechanism is so grievously, pardon the pun, important, so that affected communities really have the capacity to point out when things do go awry, but not only stop there, but actually get not only compensation in a financial term, but actually get redress with adjusted policy and adjusted behavior. And just to point out, for example, under the Green Climate Fund, there are currently 1 or 2 active cases as well, with the Green Climate Fund having a very special opportunity in its independent redress mechanism, where you actually don't have to wait until harm is occurred, but communities, when they feel that, for example, a proposal doesn't sufficiently address some of the concerns that they have, can proactively engage with the independent redress mechanism. And again, those kind of engagement opportunities are crucially important. So with that, I want to bring us home by allowing Amanda to speak next. Amanda Krohn is an associate expert on climate change and environment with the Office of the High Commissioner on Human Rights, and the core organizer of this event here. And my understanding is that Amanda will tell us a little bit more about the work that they've done jointly with and supported by the GIC on basically drawing the linkages between climate change, COVID recovery measures, and human rights. Over to you.
Well, thank you very much, Leanne, and thank you also to all of the co-organizers and speakers from my side as well. It's a pleasure and a delight to also be able to speak after all of these great interventions. And I will speak, as Leanne mentioned, briefly about this study, which we are launching and which has been supported by GIZ and BMZ, and we're very delighted to have that partnership as well. I wanted first just to step back briefly and link back to something that other speakers were mentioning before me as well, to just also highlight, of course, these linkages between climate change and human rights. And not only the way in which climate change has impacts on the effective enjoyment of a wide array of rights, and on the slide here is, of course, just a few that could be mentioned, bringing us back also to the preamble of the Paris Agreement, and the fact that states should, in accordance with that preamble, respect, promote and consider the respective obligations on human rights and any climate action. And importantly, this is also something that we know, in addition to being a rights-based approach also results in more effective and sustainable climate action. And this is something that the Human Rights Council has highlighted, for instance, in its resolution last year, 4724, but also the IPCC in its recent reports on adaptation and mitigation, and the focus there on rights-based approaches and climate justice. So just wanted to highlight that here, and also flag that more of these references are also available in our submission on the Global Stocktake. So the work on climate finance and COVID-19 recovery and human rights, it links to one of the points that Hauke Brankamp was mentioning as well before me, the fact that even though there is this shared concern for social protection in the context of both climate finance and COVID-19 response and recovery measures, we see that human rights is still insufficiently fleshed out in this nexus, and that there's essentially a holistic approach here that is missing. And one of the ways that I think highlights the lack of a connection here is the fact that several studies have highlighted the lack of green spending or sort of climate awareness in COVID-19 recovery packages. This is just a reference from one study from October of last year that highlights that Annex II countries' COVID-19 rescue and recovery policy spending, about 3% only of that amounted to what could be classified as green spending. So only a fragment, really. A human rights-based approach here is important because it proactively shapes the way that we think about climate finance and climate action. It promotes policy coherence, as we've also heard other speakers mentioning before me. And it also guards against the risk that any project actually harms and further marginalizes any person, groups, or peoples as well. So the study that we've been working on, it looks at the interconnectedness between COVID-19 response measures, climate finance, and human rights, both at the global level and also in 2 climate vulnerable countries, Fiji and Senegal. And this is my final slide, but I just wanted to highlight some of the key findings and recommendations. This is, of course, just a subset, but essentially one of the overarching points is that we need to promote an overarching human rights enhancing economy in the way that we think about finance more broadly, including climate finance. There's a need for a more robust knowledge base. There's a need for better data. That is something that also came across very strongly from the Fiji and Senegal studies. And there's a need for enhancing institutional coordination and promoting international cooperation. And this can, for instance, be through formal and informal dialogues with some of the initiatives that are underway, including, of course, under GCF. There's also a reference overall to strengthen human rights integration in interventions, in climate finance decision, and also in the way that we think about ascertaining and addressing financing gaps. And this includes, for instance, assessing what some of the costs and impacts of key climate policies, such as the National Adaptation Plan, would look like, and what the human rights enhancing ways of costing those plans could look like. So I think in the interest of time, I will leave it here, but very happy to continue to discuss the work under this study and to continue discussing climate finance and human rights more broadly. Thanks so much.
Thank you very much, Amanda, concluding our really tremendous panel here. And I think you managed to get the segue back, I think, segue back us to some of the broader discussion issues with which you started out the framing. Also, the reminder that the discussion about a human rights-based approach to climate finance needs to be centered in a wider system review and system transformation that needs to be more human rights compatible as we are looking at economic policies and financial policies more broadly, for example, in support of those more sustained, deeper and comprehensive social protection systems that we need in developing countries, but also in developed countries where we see in the name of budget austerity quite some work to undermine some of those systems. So we have now, thankfully, at least 25 minutes left for question and an engagement with the panelists. I would love to see a show of hands here in the room of people who would like to ask questions. Would take a first round of questions from the room, and we'll also check online whether there might be somebody coming in. And I see the gentleman here in the front. Please go ahead, and I see you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, and thanks for the great discussion. My name is Nidal Katbe. I'm from Palestine. It was really very useful to hear all these discussions with the great speakers here. And I use also this opportunity, having Ian here before us. I just would like to add another dimension to this discussion, which is the politicizing the accessibility for the climate finance. And I'm saying this because, for example, in Palestine, we are a state under occupation. We are, you know well, occupation is by itself is a human rights violation. When adding this to climate change issues, it is really a threat multiplier for the climate change impact. And when we adding to all these the accessibility to climate finance, where we are currently really facing some kind of challenges for accessing some kind of resources for the climate finance for political reasons. So this is another third layer, which is really put us in really critical situation. We all agree that accessing climate finance for the people who are suffering the more and who never been among the causes for climate change, this is really that something we all agree. So the idea is how do we get really out of this box, out of politicizing this process and accessing the resources for the eligible country parties. We are eligible, for example, for the all resources in the Global Environment Facility, including the STAR allocation. But for certain whatever political reasons, we are denied to have such kind of access. So I think that just we need to consider such kind of dimension in our dialogue here. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. And the lady back there.
Hi there. So it's Beth Burks here. I'm here as an observer with the ICC. My question is really to Kakashan. You mentioned the private sector, and I just was interested, what parts of the private sector are you referring to, and what would be your expectations for the private sector on integrating human rights into climate finance? Like, any of the panelists can comment if they wish, but just given that you've mentioned it. Thank you, that'd be so helpful.
Do I see any more hand at the moment from the room? Yes, please.
Hi, good morning. Thank you for the presentations. My name is Stephen Gray. I have a private sector NGO observer badge. I work at a law firm. I'm involved in a lot of transactions related to the implementation of projects, and obviously minimum safeguards, references to the Cancun safeguards, grievance mechanisms, etc., are all included in these agreements in alignment with policies such as the lady from the Green Climate Fund mentioned. When these provisions are included, then they are passed on to the project implementers and so forth. A lot of it relates to having due diligence processes in place which are followed, where you can identify risks and address them. Currently in the EU, there's a proposition to have a corporate due diligence strategies, and for corporates to disclose those strategies in order to have visibility on how, in practice, they are intending to implement those due diligence processes. Is there, from your perspective, similar approach to making sure that the provisions which are included in agreements are then disclosed in a way that you can really procure and ensure respect and protection of human rights? Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. And I'm very grateful that two of our questioners are bringing in the dimension of private sector finance and the private sector in particularly, because I think there are important considerations both in terms of obligations, but also some of the weaknesses that we see in private sector implementation of climate finance with respect to human rights observances, and hopefully we can go a little bit into that discourse. But I wanted to get back to the first question that Nadal did ask, and wanted to invite, I don't know, Dr. Tachi Obeng, if you feel comfortable maybe coming in on that point, and also Ian particularly, and then see if any of the other colleagues wanted to come in on that specific question, which was that one should really not politicize the accessibility to climate finance, that one should focus on the people in need, not the countries through which it's channeled. And that might obviously be a problem in a country-driven process like the UNFCCC, where every reference is two parties and very seldomly it is two people. So curious to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, thank you very much, Mr. Questioner. I would like to tackle the private sector and then the safeguards. I think it's very, very important for climate vulnerable countries, because we need to protect our rights and we need to also protect our assets. But unfortunately, climate change results in loss of assets, our rights and existence as humans. So that is the area that I would like to touch about. And then, looking about the current frameworks of CVF, if you look at currently, we have made a short submission on the loss and damage financial arrangements. It was started from COP26, and over here we've also made a lot of submissions on that. This loss and damage financial arrangement will go a long way to serve as a safeguard in protecting our finance so far as human rights issues are concerned. So this is one of the frameworks that we are using to take care of human rights and then climate change finance. The second aspect, which we are also considered so far as the climate change finance and then the human rights issue is concerned, is the 1.5 degree reach. Because we in climate vulnerable countries see this as a survivor. Without that, we can't do anything. Our ecological systems will be destroyed. And then our culture, in terms of our human rights, costs, and all these things are very, very important. So we are actually putting in place and then also call the bigger emitters to really reduce their emissions. Because if we go beyond the 1.5 reach, it will really going to affect our economies. As we've already said, we are already 20% behind our economic development. So it's very, very important. So we also see this as a safeguard so far as the private sector systems are concerned. And there's a new framework that we are also bringing along, which we call it Climate Prosperity Plan. Vulnerable countries are developing climate prosperity plan. And this plan goes beyond adaptation and mitigation. If you look at our NDCs allow us to adapt. Our NDCs allow us to reduce emissions. But vulnerable countries, in terms of safeguards, in terms of finance, we want to go beyond adaptation, beyond resilience, beyond our vulnerability to prosperity. That is, we want to actually use climate change to prosper, take advantage of climate change to prosper. So this is also one of the framework, and it's really in line with our human rights principles. So these are some framework that we put in place so far as the Climate Vulnerable Forum is concerned. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Ian, did you want to come in?
Yes, thank you. I might respond to the question on the occupied state of Palestine. I think there are multiple challenges here. There are climate change impacts, issues around access to water that are linked to this are significant problems. And perhaps my colleague who's the Special Rapporteur on the human rights associated with the occupied state of Palestine would be better placed to answer that question, because there is a political overlay in this issue that needs to be resolved, and UN resolutions to be respected to ensure that there isn't discrimination against states because of our political situations that add a further complexity to recognising human rights issues and access to finance. It's not something that I can easily answer in this context. There are broader political concerns here, but it's certainly the case that Palestine faces these multiple layers of complexity connected to climate change concerns as well. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And if I just can bring in an observation from the Green Climate Fund, where we had a couple of instances where there was, on political grounds, some non-approval by individual board members for specific projects and region going forward, and it includes, for example, Palestine or Cuba or Somalia as cases. In the Green Climate Fund, there is now a voting procedure for projects that would allow what is not possible in a consensus-driven process. If you have one objecting board member, for example, to move forward then with approving a project, even in some of those politicized recipient areas anyway, as long as the majority of board members are supporting the proposal. And that just to put it in the context on what is already happening. I want to pass over now to Keiko-san to respond to the question that we had, particularly on her experience with private sector engagement.
Yeah, thank you for that question. So we have worked with private sector, like companies and businesses in the past, and we understand, of course, that private sector does hold a lot of power in this whole sustainability movement, because a lot of the money does reside with them. And it's really important that we don't just think that only certain parts of private sector should be a part of advancing human rights in terms of climate finance. It just should be private sector as a whole, because that is where a lot of the problems in the past have arisen, that private sector companies, like the head office, they commit to sustainability, they commit to giving their funds to particular communities, but then a lot of them also function as transnational corporations, which means their subsidiaries kind of continue with business as usual in other parts of the world, particularly in very climate vulnerable areas. So, that is something that should be done away with. So it's not about allocating this role of advancing human rights in terms of climate finance to only particular parts of private sector. It's about making sure that it's private sector as a whole that works to either partner with NGOs or governments, or just work themselves and not just move forward in a tokenistic manner, but actually get this whole aspect of human rights and working towards justice, whether it's environment, social, or economic, at the core of their work. So I think that's really important. And the other part of that is if we are to make sure that private sector is more aware and does more, we need to get them more involved in our climate discussions as well. I think for so long, and rightfully so, we have demonized private sector as just being the villains. I think that there are a lot of companies that want to do more, so getting and working with private sectors to see what their role can be and should be is something that we should consider moving forward as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Keiko-san. And I want to bring in Tiffany from the Green Climate Fund, because the Green Climate Fund not only has a specific mandate to work with the private sector, it has a private sector facility, but also quite a number of its accredited entities and implementing partners are actually private sector entities. So maybe Tiffany, if you're still there, and I see that you are, that's wonderful. You can maybe respond to the issue that was raised about minimum safeguards and share how that is actually enforced with private sector engagement in the Green Climate Fund context.
Yeah, thanks, Leanne. I think it was an important question. At the GCF, we apply our ESS standards across the board, so we have private sector facility, we also have a lot of public projects, but the same ESS standards are applied across. And of course, using the IFC performance standards, which are actually designed for the private sector, we do make sure that the private sector is well covered. But just to come back to the question that was asked, that's not the case across the board with all different kinds of funds and financing. So it really does depend on which standards are being applied and making sure that that due diligence is really done. And beyond the due diligence, there's also the need for contractual obligations, contracts to be signed with the partner. So in our case, it would be the accredited entity, to ensure that those obligations of requirement also fed down stream to other partners, executing entities, borrowers, etc. So that's the way that we do it at the GCF. And I think it's a good model because we make sure that both public and private sector are covered by the same requirements and the same ESS standards, basically. In relation to disclosure, there are issues. Not everything is always applicable to the private sector, and this is something that's always also being discussed with the observers, and is also part of the discussions on our new ESS standards, so mentioning that as well. And if I may, I'd like to come back on the question by the delegate from Palestine. I think it's a really important question, and I think his example there was for the Global Environment Facility. And Leanne, you mentioned some sort of politics around climate financing as well, GCF and the new voting procedure, the voting procedure that's now for GCF. And I did want to point out that State of Palestine has a really great project with about 25 million GCF bond finance and about 22 million in co-financing in North Gaza about water banking and agricultural adaptation, etc. I think it's a great example of a good GCF financing. So I mean, everyone can take a look at that. It's on the website. It was approved a couple of years ago, and I think it's a really nice example. Thanks.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to quickly point out, and I'm very grateful, Tiffany, for you pointing out that there really is no difference in the due diligence between private sector and public sector in looking at the safeguards application. However, and I think this is a core thing, and Tiffany, you know that it's coming. There is unfortunately a difference how private sector is treated in terms of public accountability, in the sense of what is made transparent of, for example, their implementation record. We face that in the Green Climate Fund. We face that in other funds, that just a lot of information on both the project proposal side, whether it's applicable annexes with more detail in the case of the Green Climate Fund, but also in the implementation performance reporting are not released with the caveat that might include proprietary information. And so, you know, while we trust, in the case of the Green Climate Fund, the Secretariat to do its due diligence, it would be good, and particularly if public finance is involved, as it is with co-funding and planning of financing in the Green Climate Fund context and other climate fund contexts, to also convey with that a public obligation to the private sector to be more transparent to the broader public and not just to climate funds. That's the little dig, I guess, that I couldn't help bringing in there. I want to see if we have more questions in the room. Can you check for me also if there's anything online? I see one hand there. Please go ahead.
Hi, thank you very much. This has been really interesting to follow. I'm David Williams from the Rosa Luxemburg Foundation. I was just wondering, because we were talking about bringing in the private sector, it made me think of the court case currently against RWE, Germany's largest electricity supplier, not far away from here in Hamm, where some Peruvian farming communities from the glacial regions are taking them to court, and we should be expecting a court ruling in the coming months. And I've been here, I've been following the conversations around the Santiago network and loss and damage, so to what degree can I sort of counterbalance my disappointment about how the UNFCCC process is going on the question of loss and damage, and pin my hopes on this court case ruling to open the floodgates for the communities that I think you were talking about, Ms. Cunningham, to access real direct climate finance.
Perfect. Sorry. Can I see if there's anybody else that would be, probably in the interest of time, our last round? So if this is the last question, which is a great question, we'll go back to the panel. I would ask the panel to answer the question, and also if you have some concluding final remarks, even if you're not answering that specific question that we would want to make, please make that. And the question is obviously really related to looking outside of the structures and the governments, for example, of the climate funds and climate processes, to the role that litigation can play as an enforcer for human rights obligations that countries have, that parties have, but also that actors in the climate scene, like corporations, for example, have, and not just for specific climate finance, but the larger context of climate-related finance, if we are going into the discourse about the 2.1C and the climate compatibility of all financial flows in order for us to actually achieve the goals of the Paris Agreement. Ian, you look like you want to come in.
Well, I might address the question previous question on disclosure as well, because I think that's important. We know that the EU have sort of got a sustainable finance disclosure regulation and advancing that, and I think those sorts of initiatives are important and measures around disclosure and these disclosure requirements need to go beyond just voluntary reporting. Of course, there are concerns that some of these disclosure requirements are just greenwashing, that sort of environmental and social governance reporting that some companies are doing. There are questions around whether they're sincere or not, and so we have to advance that. And certainly in the question about litigation, this will be a sort of a landmark decision. Because it's looking at slow onset events, so it's looking at sort of future potential impacts on a community, and I think that perhaps opening the floodgates is probably not the right terminology to use for a glacial melt issue, but it's certainly, within the context of my work, I want to be, some of my work will be looking at the disclosure issue, but also litigation. And I look forward to seeing how that will go, to see whether litigation will be a driver for action. And I suspect the slowness of reaction to the loss and damage agenda needs to be driven by litigation. Thank you.
Great, thank you. And there are obviously efforts underway to bring particularly the inaction on loss and damage in front of the International Criminal Court, I believe, is one of the efforts that is underway. Wanted to check and see if Dr. Tachi Obeng, you would like to come in with a closing statement, or in response to the question that we have on litigation.
Yeah, I would just say a short thing in line with our Climate Vulnerable Forum. I would like to draw your attention, all the distinguished participants and panelists. Ghana has really taken the mantle, and our concerns and our priorities have been outlined. So any of the countries who need to join hands in our priorities could direct its action towards our permanent missions in related countries or the part of the globe that you find yourself. So I will take this opportunity to also to thank the organizers of this forum for inviting Climate Vulnerable Forum. Thank you very much.
Sorry, thank you very much, and we've been honored through your participation and the important work that the Climate Vulnerable Forum does in pointing out really the moral dimension of the climate inaction that we are facing. Kiko-san, did you want to come in, please?
Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And I think that litigation and our legal processes do play a very important role in enforcing the way we work towards climate justice. And I think that along with genocide, war crimes, crimes against humanity, and ethnic cleansing, if the courts also classify ecocide as the 5th crime against peace, I think that would be a very big step towards ensuring that we're able to view these crimes against our environment and crimes against the people who are affected by anthropogenic climate change and actually ensure justice for all of them. So I think that is very important. And of course, all laws require implementation as well. So while we have that top-down approach, at the same time, we need the bottom-up approach as well. And that is where I feel that a lot of us as civil society do come in. And that's where, for instance, we at Green Hope Foundation work through education to ensure that the implementation, even if the laws aren't there as yet, is very much at the ground level, and we're doing that from the bottom up. So just in conclusion, I would say that there needs to be a lot more done to bridge the gap between the top-down and bottom-up approaches in terms of advancing human rights for climate finance. And if we are really to ensure that the funding reaches those who are most vulnerable to climate change, we have to take into account their unique lived experiences and not just continue with business as usual. And I named my organization Green Hope Foundation, so I do have hope that it is possible to really build this better world. But for right now, there is a lot more action that needs to be taken. And I think this is having this discussion and the fact that we're addressing this, I think, is a very good starting point. Thank you.
Thank you. Eileen, over to you.
Thank you, Leanne. Yes, and thank you for all the comment from the panelists. I was thinking about the litigation. Litigation, I think, is the expression of that inclusion of human rights has been a fail in all this discussion. And it's not the first time we've seen other litigation process in Latin America with indigenous people, but this also bring, I think for all this process is necessary also the support of the allies like CSOs and another group, because indigenous people, local communities don't have the access to resources that are necessary to bring all these cases outside the countries. And in the countries, sometimes we don't have the recognition as indigenous people or the space to bring all these discussions. So, and also have something, can have security problems in all the regions. We see around in Latin America, Colombia, one of the biggest areas with criminalization of indigenous people leader for the defense of their rights. So we also think, I was thinking about the other question about the inclusion of the private sector. There is different kind of private sector around the world, and indigenous people don't say no to private sector. What indigenous people say, private sector have to comply with the due diligence in safeguard and human rights issues. And there is the UN guiding principle on human rights and business. So this is something that we have been also always raised, that is important to take into account. Human rights should be, and also human rights in climate finance should put in the peoples, not only indigenous people, but people in the center of all the discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Eileen. That could be our final word, but I want to give the opportunity also to Tiffany, who has been listening and joining us, from Songdo, to have a closing statement. Although probably not reflecting that much on the issue of litigation, as we don't have that as a process in the Green Climate Fund.
Yeah, that's right, Leanne. No, I don't have many things left to say, just to thank all the panelists and all the people in the audience as well. For me, it was really a learning experience to be here as well, not only to come and share, but to really listen. And I really appreciated the opportunity to do that, so thank you very much.
Thank you, Tiffany, for the engagement. And I want to turn to Amanda.
Well, thank you very much, and thank you also to all of the participants for the good questions and for being here. I also just wanted to highlight as a resource the observations and decisions of human rights mechanisms more broadly. For instance, the Human Rights Committee that has engaged on climate change, and the upcoming general comment of the Committee on the Rights of the Child with a focus on climate change as well. And of course, the UN Working Group on Business and Human Rights has also developed one of its reports on human rights due diligence. And I finally also wanted to thank discussants and participants for raising these linkages between disclosure and transparency and the right to access to information, meaningful participation, and of course also the links to accountability and environmental defenders, as Eileen was just mentioning as well. And this is also at the heart of a set of key messages on climate change, human rights and business, a copy of two of which I think may still be outside this room as well. So thank you again very much for the rich discussion.
Great, and since we are slightly over time, but that was almost unavoidable with the very rich and engaging discussion that we had. I wanted to thank all of you for coming, and particularly if you could give a big hand to our wonderful panel. Thank you.